I'm going to continue with the kinds of insects that make galls. In this lecture, we'll talk about those that feed by chewing on the plants, flies or wasps that make galls, and these can produce some very unusual forms. So let's start with the gall midges. This is a very big family of insects. It is the second biggest family of gall-producing insects that we have, next to the gall wasps, which will be at the end of this lecture. The kind of galls, though, that gall midges produce are fairly simple in their form. You're going to see some sort of stunting of developing tissues, so they just don't elongate normally. There could be some enlargement associated with this, so then it becomes big and rounded, maybe a leaf curl or a bulbous area around a leaf or a leaf margin, and it can be some combination of these events, but it's caused by selective feeding by the midges as they braze developing tissues and introduce some saliva that cause these stunting or enlargements of plant growth. So an example would be honey locust podgall midge. This is associated with the developing leaves of honey locust, and it causes the developing leaves to curl over and thicken and swell, and the young develop within it. In the picture on the lower left, you can see an adult of the honey locust podgall midge, and this is a typical gall midge adult. They kind of look vaguely mosquito-like or fungus gnat-like, but they have a habit of producing within plants or reproducing within plants, and often make some sort of distortion. So the adults are going to lay eggs on emerging leaflets, and in this case there will be multiple generations produced annually, because honey locust produces new growth over a multi-month period, so there's new growth all the time. And the form you're going to see that is produced by the galls of this insect is the leaflets, instead of normally elongated, which are indicated in some degree on the picture in the lower left. There are some normal leaflets there. Instead, get distorted by curling and then folding and thickening to produce a little pod. And the developing insect larva, or larvae, usually multiple larvae within each of these pods, will be found within it. So in the picture in the upper left, we see two larvae and a pupa of a honey locust podgall midge within one of these little pod-like growths that have been induced from a leaf curl and thickening and distortion. Similarly, you could go to a pinion, and there's also another one that does this on ponderosa pine, where the base of the needle gets thickened. And this, in this case, would be the pinion spindle gall midge, and were you to look at the base of this unusually thickened needle, you will see a chamber within which there are developing midge larvae, developing fly larvae of this species. The adults will come out, and they will lay their eggs coincident when the new growth comes out. And again, this will be a repeating theme with all gall makers. The galls are produced on new growth that is actively growing, and so the life cycle of these insects are associated with the development of their host plant. Another case where we see a kind of thickening and swelling and curling in a more gross form would be a gouty vein gall midge, gall on a box elder leaf. So instead of a single leaflet of a box elder, we see a whole leaflet of a box elder turned into this gall. So much more obvious than the honey locust podgall midge. Another one less commonly seen around here, but also occurs, would be on the leaflets of some kinds of ash, the ash midrib gall midge. So you see little gall midge larvae within this folded swelling of an ash leaf. Sometimes they hit new growth and cause it to stunt, which produces an unusual form that may look very different. In the case of these gall midges on junipers, they affect the tip growth, and so the tips don't normally elongate, but instead they swell, and it looks rather flower-like. Another case where you have a gall midge that develops on the tips of growing tissues would be some of the willow cone gall midges. And instead of normally elongate, they swell and stunt and produce what looks like cones. But these are actually terminal distortions of shoots that normally would have elongated were they not affected by the feeding activities of these kinds of insects. And you can see gall midges affecting fruiting structures as well. Not too common in terms of examples, but one common example would be chokecherry fruit gall midge, where you look at a series of fruit on a chokecherry tree, and every once in a while one looks a little puffy, a little distended, not quite right. And were you to open it up at the right time, you might see these little kind of orangey larvae within it, and that's the insect that has induced a growth change, a developing seed or fruit to become a gall. But mostly gall midges are associated with the not the flowers, but the leaves and developing shoots of plants. Moving on to another group of flies, and there's really only one example why we bring these up in terms of gall making, would be the family of flies known as leaf miners. And most insects in this family make leaf mines, and we have discussed that before. So the larvae develop within the leaf and emerge, and that's the kind of injury they're associated with it. But there's one individual species that is pretty common in this leaf miner fly family that instead lays its eggs into twigs instead of leaves, and instead of there being a leaf mine, you get a twig gall. So this is the poplar twig gall, produced by the poplar twig gall fly, which is in the family of leaf miner flies. And it's an insect where you to look at the gall that had been produced, the little swelling on a twig of an aspen, and you look at it in the fall, you look at it in the winter, you look at it in early spring, you might see the developing insect within it. It's just a little kind of greenish yellow maggot buried deeply within that little swelling on the twigs of an aspen usually. And this is the insect that caused that growth of the twig to become swollen and distorted. It will come out in the adult form sometime in spring when the new growth comes out. And the adult form of the poplar twig gall fly is a small, dark fly, not normally observed. It's usually seen, if you will find it, resting on the leaves of young aspen leaves that are coming out, again, quite early in the spring. The poplar twig gall fly females will, incidentally, periodically puncture the leaves to with their ovipositor to get sap from the leaf, and so these injuries may be exemplified in the picture in the lower right, where you might see little spots and tears in a leaflet, and that was caused by injuries made by the adult female as she was trying to get moisture and sap out of the leaf through puncturing it with their ovipositor. But after they do that, if they fed and they're ready to lay eggs, they will go and lay eggs into the twigs. And here's a female laying its laying an egg in the twig of a developing aspen twig. And normally you don't see much, even for the next couple of weeks. There might be a little swelling, as indicated in the upper right, that will be induced from the effect of the egg being laid and the developing young within that, but not much. And you don't see much until usually sometime in midsummer if you're really tracking this insect, and then you'll see a quite large swelling as indicated in the lower left. Now, one thing about this insect, other than the other gall-making insects, is this is a species that makes a gall on a twig, and the twig tissues on which it makes a gall do not die, and they don't seem to be all that affected other than being swollen. But furthermore, the tissues that have been damaged by this, have been turned into a little swelling, will continue to grow in a healthy manner, but they will also continue to grow and be swollen. So in the picture in the upper left here, we see a fairly young aspen tree that has galls that were induced by the poplar twig gall fly over many, many years. And except for perhaps some on the far right that were produced, say, the previous year, all the other galls have not been occupied by an insect for 1 to maybe 6 or 7 years. But the plant continues to create a swelling around the original wound site. Insect's long gone, and there's nothing you can do about the wounds after they have been initially induced to produce, but it also doesn't seem to be causing much damage to the plant. Then, last but not least, there's the most important and interesting group of gall-making insects, the gall wasps. And this is the biggest group of gall-making insects in terms of diversity of species. Over 800 species in North America. They make galls of very unusual appearance. The underlying tissues are not a simple swelling. They're going to be radically transformed. And furthermore, they are generally quite specific in terms of the plants that you will see them on. Almost all the gall wasps are associated with oak or closer related species. A couple are found on roses and related rose family plants. But of these 800 species in North America, almost always are going to be producing some sort of really strange growth on a leaf or a bud or a stem of some kind of oak or related plant. So these make galls of very different forms. We call it a determinate gall. They look very different than the tissues from which they've been differentiated. So in this case, we see 2 little ball type growths on an oak on the upper left and a rose on the lower right, and that's leaf tissue that got turned into a ball, a section ball, or a ball with little spines on it. And there's a developing gall wasp in each of these, a different kind of gall wasp. It could be a fuzzy ball, in this case on a major vein on an oak tree. It could be several of them together, in this case a kind of smoothish gall. It kind of looks to me like turnips. In each one of these there's a developing little gall wasp. A very common gall wasp we see on bur oak has this form, where it's a section colored ball, and there's one developing gall wasp in each one of these balls, and each one of these balls was leaf tissue that had been transformed into this gall form by the insect that is now living within that gall form. Another kind of gall that's more simple might be a little raised area in the upper surface and fuzzy balls on the undersurface. Perhaps a little bit confusing with the eriophyid mites and the arenium, but these are much more in large kinds of fuzzy areas, these fuzzy balls in the underside. These are much bigger animals than our eriophyid mites. In this case, we see a very large fuzzy gall that is produced on the stem of a native oak here in Colorado. And again, there's a gall wasp that develops in that. In this case, we see 3 galls produced by a gall wasp that have a fuzzy form, but there's also a little purpling associated with them. Again, a developing gall wasp is developing within each one of these. And then gall wasp will also make some very large galls that attract attention, the roly-poly galls or the oak apple galls. So a roly-poly gall would be a round growth on an oak leaf. And again, there's a single developing wasp that's in the middle of this gall that has been feeding and inducing that leaf tissue to have made that gall. In this case, we see galls that are made on a rose, multiple galls of spiny form and ball form on a rose, whereas another gall wasp on rose tweaks this a little bit, instead makes a single ball, and multiple larvae develop within a single large spiny ball that grows on the twigs of a rose. one of the more commonly visible kinds of gall wasp in much of Colorado is one on oaks, particularly bur oak, which is pretty widely planted in the western U.S. now. Makes a very large, rough gall on the twigs of oak, bur oak in this case, that is kind of in a ball form. The oak rough bullet gall wasp. I want to talk about it in a little more detail because it also allows us to bring up the subject that many of these gall wasps have two different forms. They have two different stages. They are all associated with oak, but they make different galls. So one gall-making wasp might make two different kinds of galls. So in the case of the oak rough bullet gall wasp, it produces very conspicuous galls on twigs, and that's what people most notably will observe. The insects that have produced those galls are going to emerge in the adult form sometime in mid to late fall, so usually around Halloween, mid-October into mid-November. These wasps come out, and then they lay their eggs into the terminal buds. Now, the plant is dormant through the winter. Next spring, when the new leaves come out and growth resumes, a gall forms that was produced from that egg that had been laid in the bud last fall. It's not a very conspicuous gall. It's a very small gall. It looks like a bud. So these are small bud galls that result from the eggs laid by the insect in fall, and a little wasp will emerge from that bud gall. In fact, there'll be males and females at this time that emerge from those bud galls, and they will mate, and the females will then lay their eggs into the shoots of the new oak shoots. So spring stage adults are much smaller than those observed in the fall, and you get both females and males. And the spring stage adults lay their eggs in the emergent twig growth, and then that's what produces the summer form galls. And the summer form galls, when they first erupt from a leaf, are just a little small conical type of gall. They gradually enlarge, they get smooth, and one unusual thing that is associated with these is that the fully formed galls also start to ooze a fluid that is honeydew-like and is attractive to wasps. So the rough bullet galls attract many kinds of insects that will feed on this ooze that is coming off these galls. So you might see wasps, you might see bees, you might see beetles, you might see flies, and what they're feeding on the galls of this bur oak is a honeydew that is exuding from the gall, and an insect within that gall has caused it to produce this fluid. And some of these galls can be very different from the underlying tissues. The one that has always made an impression on me are oak apple galls, which are very large. They're the size of a small hen's egg, with a hard crust on the outside. When you break it open in the inside, it looks like sphagnum moss, and these develop on the terminal buds of certain eastern red oaks, not a Rocky Mountain insect, but one that's found elsewhere. Quite a large and very distinctive gall that is a distortion of a bud of a red oak. And these, by the way, are full of tannic acid, and originally, up until the late 1800s, many of the, or most all the ink that was used to produce documents, to produce manuscripts or whatever, including our Constitution, Declaration of Independence, was produced by extracting the tannins from these galls on oak to produce iron gall ink, something that perhaps you may wish to look a little more into. Anyway, one last gall to show is one that's on rose. In this case, it's the mossy rose gall. In this insect, it induces a gall that does not have a covering on the outside. It's just kind of this mossy-like growth that is induced to grow on the stems of a susceptible rows. If you were to cut it away, you could see little chambers where you could see the developing insects that were feeding on this stem tissue of a rose. Here they are. These are the little wasp larvae. And they're feeding through the chewing, but mostly through the production of saliva that has enzymes, has induced the tissues around them to grow into this specific kind of form, this mossy rose gall in this case. So, what do we do about gall insects? I think the most important thing is to just try to keep this into perspective. Really be careful in terms of assessing how damaging these things are. Overestimation of effects is typical because galls are unusual in form, and one's eye will go to see what kind of injury is present in front of their face. But if you step back and you look at how much of the plant is affected, is often far less. So gall production is typically something that looks a lot worse than it is. There's very few cases where galls are going to have serious impacts on the growth of the plant. All of those that do exist are ones that affect stems, not leaves, such as the oak rough bullet gall or some of the galls that are on stems of roses. And even those rarely cause significant injury. It is also important to remember that only developing tissues can be transformed into a gall. And this often comes up when somebody has a concern about a certain number of galls they might see on a plant, and their concern isn't that a whole lot of the plant is affected at this point, but will it spread? And the way you can answer this is that it cannot spread to any of the leaves that are already out. If they're already out, they're no longer susceptible to be turned into a gall, because only actively growing tissues can be turned into galls. So once they've fully expanded, they're no longer gallable. Only actively growing tissues are gallable. So this is not a true word, but let's use it for this discussion. So in this case, we see that hackberry nipple gall psyllid example, where the central leaves were growing at a time when eggs were being laid, and the actively growing leaves were very susceptible to be turned into galls. But after that point, the leaves beyond that and prior to that point, there were leaves that had developed that were not in a stage that could be turned into a gall. They did not coincide with the actively developing stages of the insect at the time that the leaf was actually growing. So only actively growing tissues can be turned into galls or are gallable. If you wish to control them, and again, there's relatively few situations where this would have really important impact in tree health, although it could have important impact in terms of appearance, which would be important if you're trying to sell plants. Ask yourself, do they overwinter on the plant? And if they do, then a spray of some kind during the dormant season, when the leaves are not out, when the plant is not actively growing, could be appropriate. Not too many do overwinter on the plant, or at least in stages that they are susceptible. But one that does is this Cooley spruce gall. So in the upper left is that picture I've shown several times already, where you have these two little overwintering stage nymphs of this insect, and these are very easily controlled. They are on the underside of twigs, within 6 to 8 inches from the tip, usually on the east and west, east and north sides of the tree, but all throughout the tree. Anyway, they're just sitting there, and were you to contact them with a soap, an oil, or some other kind of insecticide, you could kill them. You would want to do that, if you wish to control this insect, before they produce that egg sac that they will produce, as indicated in the lower right. So if you wait until, say, May 1, they produce 600-800 eggs, then you'd have to kill all those. 2 months before that, they're just that little tiny dot that we see in this picture, and could be easily smothered by an oil or killed by a soap. But often they overwinter off the plant. Often they're not exposed during the wintertime. And so then you generally want to think of a timing treatment for when these insects are laying eggs. So treatment should coincide with egg laying, and egg laying usually is associated with new growth. So hackberry psyllids, they're out and about when the new growth is coming out, because it can only turn leaves into galls that are actively growing. Honeylocusts podgall midge, they lay their eggs on the newly emerging leaflets. They have multiple generations because there's lots of new leaves coming out, but that's the only tissues that can be turned into a gall, and that would be the target for a control. Pinyon spindle gall midge, they lay eggs at the base of a newly emergent needle in June, and when those newly emergent needles are coming out, that would be the target period. So, in summary, we're talking about gall makers. There are many families of insects, and one family of mites, the aerified mites, that are most common the cause of a plant gall. Almost always it's some kind of insect or mite. And these are usually quite specific in terms of the plants they occur on. So it is possible, if you learn your gall-making insects, you can identify the plants when you see the gall, because they will be found on one kind of plant or another kind of plant. These galls are often noticeable curiosities because of their unusual appearance, but they are much less important than they normally would be perceived in terms of plant health. These are something that looks worse than they are. There are galls that will, over time, stunt plant growth, particularly galls that occur on stems, but these are rare, and it takes a long time for them to have any noticeable effect when they do. These are not tree killers. Controls, were you to attempt them, should be targeted at susceptible life stages of the gall maker, and that could be a period when they are exposed on the plant, such as a Cooley spruce gall aphid that's exposed on the plant during the winter, or when the adults return to the plants to lay eggs, which is usually when the new leaves are just coming out or the new needles are just coming out. So I think that wraps up gall makers. A lot of stuff here. I'm not going to test on a lot of this material. I do want you to become familiar with the gall makers and to refer to the sections in the book that show some of the common gall makers we have. But again, a lot of pictures. That was the main point of the last two little spots here we had.